Hello everyone and welcome to MS 2900 Exploring Media Theory. This is the third lecture in this series. It's a pre-recorded lecture. Today we're going to be looking at Marxism and the media and their political economic approaches, or, and I've got it on the screen here, the class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. Now that's a quote from Marx, and I'll explore more about that in a moment. This lecture we're going to cover lots of different things, and I'm going to introduce you to quite a number of Marxist terms and concepts. And I'll run through them fairly quickly at the start. We've got about 30 slides, so it'll take a fair amount of time to go through. Don't worry, some of the terms are very complex and quite tricky to understand, but it's a nice diagram about halfway through the lecture that will help you put these terms into context a little bit more. So you can try and keep up with what I'm saying, and I don't mean in a patronising way, but if you do get confused, please feel free to spool back with the video until you understand it. But don't worry too much if you don't get it straight away. It's a bit like the pieces of a jigsaw. And once you get the different bits, you can see how they fit together. They kind of help to illustrate each other a bit more. One fun thing, I've got a bit of a sore throat this week, so my voice is a bit weak. So please excuse that kind of fogginess in my throat. Okay, let's go. So this week we're going to look at aspects of the most influential non-religious philosophy the world has ever known. Now, it's decreased in significance to a certain degree now, but at one point vast swathes of the world were actually running under a Marxist-inspired form of governance. So the whole of China, which is, of course, as you're well aware, I think about 1/3 of the world's population, lived under a form of communism that drew from Marxism. All of Russia, most of Central Europe, large swathes of South America, and a number of countries in Africa, were all running under a system called communism, which derives from Marxism. So Marx had an incredible effect, and some people have said that Marx has had more impact in the world than any non-religious philosopher. His work has impacted upon more people's lives. So in the next lecture, we're going to examine how Marxism has understood and engaged with the media. Today we're going to cover a basic description of certain key tenets of Marxism. We'll start slow with the basics, but we'll move quite quickly. And we're going to have a look at an examination of one strand of Marxism, what's called political economic Marxist analysis, and we're going to apply that to digital media. And we're going to look at the work of one theorist, a gentleman named Professor Christian Fuchs. He's from the University of Westminster. So we'll look at his work in particular. Okay. Well, essentially, Marxism is a theory of how society functions. It's a theory that was developed to try and explain how society functions and what's going on in the world. And it's based upon the idea that certain groups in a society exercise power over other groups. Some groups are more powerful, you might call them classes or something else like that, but there's certain groups in our society that are more powerful than others. Marx was writing about this way back in the middle of the 19th century, from about 1845 onwards. Anyway, and he looked at society around him and he saw there were dominant groups, dominant classes in that society. Today we still have the same kind of ideas, that there are dominant groups in our society that retain power. Marx wants to know how they do it and why they do it. Now, this power is used to oppress others and to keep power for themselves and for their kin. And Marxism sees its role to reveal how this power is maintained and exercised through different systems. So Marxism is both a description of the world and an analysis of the world, but also it's a prescription for change. Marxism was arguing for a more equitable and more fair society, where not single groups would be in charge. So his work is both useful in terms of analysing society, but also finding ways in which we can improve society. And as I mentioned, it emerged during the 19th century, and it very much reflects the perspective of the time in its vision of history. So it was looking at the world from 19th century positions, and it has in there lots of values. Some of those values are a bit problematic, but for the most part we can still use a lot of Marxism today. But we've got to remember some of the ideas do date from 900 or 200 years ago. Now, Marx lived from 1818 to 1883. He was originally from a town called Trier in Germany. It was in Prussia at the time, but it became part of Germany. He moved around a lot. He spent a significant amount of time in Paris and then in Belgium. He was thrown out of his own country and expelled for his political beliefs, and similarly from France and from Belgium. He ended up in London, where the British authorities, although they didn't grant him a passport and citizenship rights, he was allowed to live there. And so he became what's known as a stateless person. He floated around. He ended up living and dying in relative poverty, really. He worked as a journalist for a number of newspapers, but never really made much money. But his work was incredibly influential. There's a lot of his work, enormous number of, not enormous number, but a large number of books and volumes came out of it, and it's very complex, very theoretical work. He initially started training as a lawyer, but switched across to philosophy and literature in his later part of university and started again. And it was in that area that he did his PhD, and he wrote primarily. So he's primarily a philosopher, but he also trained himself in economics and sociology and a number of other fields. So he was without doubt an absolute genius, and one of the giants of the intellectual stage of the past couple of hundred years. Now, while Marx's work is intrinsic to the worldwide communist project, that political system that dominated China, dominated Russia, much of Eastern Europe, large parts of South America, and indeed most of the conflicts pre-war on terror from the 9/11 thing were actually between the US and the communist systems, particularly Russia. And many of the conflicts that were going on were really proxy wars between these two systems, the capitalist system on one hand and the communist system on the other. It's also been extremely influential as an academic critical position, and it's used in many, many different disciplines. So you'll find Marxists work within the media, they work within politics, sociology, there's a number in geography, in literature it's very dominant. So it's all over the place. It's a very powerful critical approach. Now, so academic Marxism, the kind of approach, the kind of thing we're going to talk about here, runs parallel to political Marxism. And for a long while, academic Marxism was tarnished by the kinds of atrocities that were committed in the name of communism. Communism has proven very, very brutal. Stalin, with the leaders of the Russian system, killed millions. 20 million is believed to be the total there, and millions more died in various wars in Southeast Asia and around that part of the world as communism fought democracies, but also ended up fighting itself. There's a war between Vietnam and Cambodia, both of which were communist empires. So lots and lots of people have died. Now that terrible conflicts and so on did kind of tarnish the academic approach to it. Although as communism gradually declined as a system of governance in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the Russian Empire finally fell and what was called the Iron Curtain, which was a system whereby Europe was divided, so many countries were behind what was called the Iron Curtain and were in communist systems. So things like Poland and the Czech Republics, and Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Hungary, and Romania and Ukraine were all behind the Iron Curtain, and were satellite states to the Soviet Union. Well, all that collapsed post-1989 when the Iron Curtain came down. And since that point, academic Marxism has had a bit of a resurgence. And many of the predictions that Marx talked about in his early work and were taken up by academics have actually proven to be very prescient and quite useful for explaining our contemporary times. So I'm going to turn now to some basic Marxist ideas. So I was just having a cough there. So I want to turn now to some basic Marxist ideas. One of the key ideas is that human societies change over time. There's a line of progress, and you can look back over time and see societies are getting better and progressing and evolving. And they say there's a distinct trajectory. Human societies are going in a particular direction. There is a structure to the progression of human societies. And in study of these kind of ideas, this is known as a teleological understanding. So telos means end purpose. In a way you can see far with a telescope. You can see a long way, and a television allows you to see something from a distance. So teleos is there's an end purpose, something we're working towards. There's a view or belief that there's a distinct direction and goal, a progression towards an eventual fixed state. So there is a specific engine, however, in history that somehow drives us to this thing. So if you think about it, we're working towards a new form of society, but there's something causing societies to change and move in a particular direction. And we term that kind of an engine of change, something that's driving the development. Now for Marx, he saw the engine of change as something called historical materialism. So there's groups in societies, and groups tend to be defined by their relationship with the system that's used to produce the essentials of life. So if you think about it, what a society needs to live on, well, it needs food, it needs running water, it needs some agriculture, it might need some ways of exchanging the goods. Where do we live? Well, we live in houses, so we've got to build houses. All the things that produce what a society needs. In our day and age, these are factories and so on. But those are called the means of production, the things that a society needs to produce the essentials of that society. Now, different groups have different relationships with those means of production. Some groups own the means of production. They're lucky enough to be the owners of these factories, the owners of the shops, the owners of the farms and so on. Other people don't own it, so they're the workers. So they exist in a slightly different relationship with the means of production. Now, there's different ways of organising this thing. If you go back to different periods of time, you find different groups of people in charge of it. So those are termed modes of production, when different groups of people own the means of production. So in different modes of production, different groups have control over the means of production. And I do appreciate these terms are a bit too similar for our help, for ease of use. But try and get them. So means of production is what we need to make in society. Mode of production is the system by which we allocate who owns it. And this is important because control over the ownership of the means of production allows you to possess the surplus, the bit that's produced above what we absolutely need to survive. So say if you're living somewhere and you produce, I don't know, say you own a little farm, and you start up by producing just enough that you and your family need to live on. But after a while, you expand the boundaries of your farm, and now you're producing more than your family needs to live on. Well, that's called surplus, and you can trade that for other goods. Now, if you own the farm, you've got control of that surplus. But if you've got some of that money, then what you can do, you can hire somebody else to come in and work for your farm. They won't possess any of that surplus, they'll still work for you, but you've got control over the surplus goods. That's very important in Marxist theory. Now, the engine of change is conflict between the groups. So Marxism is a theory of conflict. It looks about how conflict brings about change. And it's conflict between different groups that causes change. So gradually a system will evolve. And we might say something like, the particular people end up owning all the farms. It might be the kings, or it might be the largest people on the land, the toughest people. And gradually inequalities become apparent. So you've got your king, and he owns lots of farmland, and you've got your peasants, and they gradually don't own very much. The king gets richer and richer, the peasants have nothing for their labour apart from the daily wage. And slowly pressure builds up between these two groups. They get the poor on one hand get a bit more fed up, until finally there's some form of conflict. And conflict overwhelms, and it all breaks down, but a new system emerges. A new group rise to power, and they take over. And this has occurred time and time again over history. So that is what Marx sees as the engine of change, conflict between groups. Now Marx sees history is divided into roughly 9 stages, and his stages really relate to the nature of who owns the means of production. So these are different stages, these different modes of production. Who does it? So if you go right back to the early stage, you've got what he termed primitive communist systems. So this is going way back into Neolithic times. Now back when Marx was writing in the mid-1840s, 1850s and 1860s, our understanding of history and archaeology is not what it is today. So some of his categories are a bit weird and don't quite fit what we understand. But you should be able to get the general idea. So we had primitive communist systems, and here we sort of like, these are hunter-gatherer societies. There was no surplus produced. They lived under what was called subsistence living. So you gathered what you needed to eat that day, and you didn't have anything, you didn't have any reserve. So those kind of societies existed for several thousand years, but gradually more civilized ways, or what we term civilized ways, gradually emerged. So over in the ancient world, what we term Mesopotamia, which is ancient Egypt, and also parts of India in the Indus Valley, new systems emerged. This is what the ancient world. And here, there were certain groups began to take over the surplus. These claimed to be deities or descendants of the gods. They took over the surplus value and established a priestly class. And as the world evolved and human life evolved, we moved into what Marx terms the antique world. Here we're talking about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And here you have much more advanced agricultural systems. But they made extensive use of slave power. So here the surplus values, well, it was kept by the slave owners, and the slaves weren't paid anything. They were actually owned. And from that system we moved into what was termed the feudal system. And this is really medieval Europe from about 500 AD onwards. And here you had much more complex systems of agriculture. You had ownership of the land, and instead of slaves we had serfs. And of course these systems weren't worldwide or anything, and they only appeared in a few bits. And there were still slave systems going on in various parts of Europe at the same time. But you had aristocrats and serfs. And serfs were tied to a particular parcel of land, that they would work on that land. Then we move into what Marx termed the early capitalist period. This is really sort of like, the early emergence of the reign of sort of, it was from about 1650 to about 1850. Actually, the date on there is wrong. So it should say 1850. And here we had the emergence of nation states and the emergence of many of the systems that we understand today. So there's things like mercantile capitalism, trading capitalism, large navies taking goods around the world. There was wage labour rather than feudal labour. So although there were still systems of slavery going on, for many the system was you were paid a set wage to do particular work. And out of this system emerged two new classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie were the capital earning, small businessmen, people able to trade, and the proletarians were ones that didn't have any capital and would work for the bourgeoisie. From about 1850 we move into what was termed mid-capitalist or middle modernity, and here you have the emergence of corporate capitalism, the rise of non-state powerful companies and the welfare state and so on. And by the end of that you get into the late capitalist period where you've got financial capitalism. You had the industrialisation of money, you have global markets, consumerism and civil unrest, until finally you get to the end of capitalism will collapse. Marx predicts you'll get something called socialism. And here this is an early form of communism. Capitalism collapses, although how quickly it collapses is debatable. You'll have emergent socialist societies will set up. There'll be people bartering systems. There'll be people setting up small co-ops to trade systems. Now some argue we're beginning to enter that period. Some Marxists say we can see evidence of this. You've got things like free cycle, you've got alternative ways of trading goods. Other people say no, it's just an end point of late capitalism. And finally Marx says, well, at the end of socialism we'll move into communism. And here you won't have ownership of the means of production by a few elite people, it'll be owned by all. Everyone will have an equal share. In fact, we'll have an abolition of money and of private property completely. We will all own everything. That's quite a hard concept to grasp, I appreciate that. But anyway, those are the 9 phases of Marxism. Now, when he was writing, he talked quite openly about these ones and these ones down here, down to feudalism. This kind of idea here was taking Marx's work and developing further by other Marxist theorists. The socialism and communism That was also part of his early work. So he did see capitalism. He didn't plot it out as nicely as here, because he only lived until about 1881. So he didn't live to see these ages, but he did predict the kind of systems that we would have going on today. Okay, now the economic system that underpins each of these stages is distinct and different, and these are conceived of as the relations of production. There's a third term now, so you've got means of production, which is how we produce the things, the mode of production, which is the system we use to organise it, and the relations of production. The relations of production are things like property relations. What's our relationship to ownership of the means of production? Who owns our factories, fields and workplaces? What about the division of labour between people? Who sets up the systems of work and so on? And what are the conditions under which we work? You know, do we work as an indentured worker? Are we a serf, slave, wage labourer, or whatever? So these describe the kind of experiences that we have within a particular mode of production. Okay, now we move on to two other slightly related ideas. So we've got the idea of what's called the base. Now, the relations of production determine the type of economy, and this is termed the base of society, the underlying foundation. Now, all other aspects of society, culture, religion, even the legitimate forms of sexual relationship, whether you have to get married, whether you can get divorced, all those kind of things that govern that, all forms of civil society, such as education, the legal system, media, entertainment. And Marx is arguing that all these systems are a consequence of a base, and we might term those the superstructure. So the base directly determines the superstructure, and this kind of system is known as economism, or economic determinism. Now, if you think back to lecture 1 the other week, I was talking about forms of determinism. Well, this is a really good example of this. So Marx is saying that the economic system of a society determines the culture of that society. And the economic system are things like, you know, the relations of production and things like that, and that directly affects the kind of culture that that society produces. So every society is different, but it's different by the economic system. And it's the economic system that produces the kind of culture that that society has. Now, moreover, this other stuff legitimizes the base. So all the culture we've got, all our systems, all our education and our entertainment systems, they make the economic system look more legitimate, or allow us to think of it as a fair system. So the base structures the superstructure, and the superstructure maintains the base. Let's do a diagram here. This is quite a difficult thing to do. So let me talk you through it slowly. So down the bottom, we've got time here. As time is progressing from, you know, ancient times on the left-hand side, right through to sort of like modern times here and there. Now, you've got the mode of production down here. These are the different systems by which society has been organised. So back here, you've got feudalism, you've got early capitalism, you've got late capitalism. Now, if you remember that thing I showed you where Marx had his 9 phases, so if you were to go further down this way, so like further along from feudalism, you go back to the Asiatic period and the ancient world and things like that. And if you keep going this way, you'll end up with a socialist system and finally communism. So I've kind of taken a bit of a snapshot of these systems here. Now, so those are the mode of productions going on there, and it changes over time. Now, on this level here, we've got the base. So these are the ways in which society is organised. So under feudalism, the means of production was agriculturalism, and the relations of production, the kind of experience people had, serfdom and sharecropping and things like that. By the time we move to early capitalism, well, the means of production has shifted to industrialism. So you've got the Industrial Revolution occurring here. The relations of production change. Now we're moving into wage labour, and the kind of two-class system we've got is the bourgeoisie versus the proletarians. When we move across into late capitalism, well, the means of production is finance capitalism. So if you think of very, big economies like the UK and the US, and even other economies like Singapore, they don't actually produce many things. They use other countries to produce the things. Instead, what they do here is work from finance capitalism. The City of London is meant to be one of the UK's largest engines of growth, financially. So finance capitalism. Here, the relations of production are things like capital accumulation. People trying to save up money that way. Share ownership is seen to be a big way to make money. So you've got your base level there. And so different systems will have different forms of economies. Does that make sense? Okay, now above that we've got what Marx terms the superstructure. So this is the culture and all the other things. So if you go back to feudalism, well, in the superstructure there you had religion, music, royalty, family, folklore and education. By the time you get to early capitalism, it's shifted around slightly. Not that much, but the kind of culture has changed. We've had the emergence of the mass media. Music has changed. Family relations have changed from extended families, which were common in earlier periods, to more nuclear families. Religion, we've become less religious in some aspects. There's been a decline of the large religions, such as, and a fraction of the large religions. We've become a more secular society. Education has become more formalised. Folklore was still present, but not to the degree it was. By the time we get to late capitalism, well, mass media and also digital media have taken over now. Religion is still important, but it's slightly changed. And you've got the emergence of new religious movements. You've got more music, family and education. So the culture changes. What Marx says is the reason the culture changes is because the economic base changes. So finally, the base determines the superstructure. So the base produces the kind of culture. But what also happens is that the superstructure maintains the base. It makes it look legitimate. It makes all these kind of things here, make these things acceptable to people. So the music industry, the mass media, religion, they tell us it's okay that these systems, they don't openly challenge them. And things change over time and new systems emerge, but they always legitimate what's going on down here. Okay, so the components of the superstructure serve to maintain and legitimate the base. Aspects of culture help to maintain the relations of production by making them seem legitimate. Now with the media, this has been the topic of discussion, and the relationship between the media and the economic system is very, very complex. And that's been a big area of study for Marxists over many years. So how does the media legitimate the base? Marx is understood to have produced two theories for understanding the media. In his early work, he produced what later became known as the political economic understanding. This characterised his early work, and we'll talk about more of that in a moment, and it was taken up by many different theorists. And in contemporary times, this gentleman, Christian Fuchs, at Westminster, uses those theories to understand digital media. There's also another side to Marx's work, which is called a more ideological understanding. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. And that was partly an unfinished project, but it's been extensively developed by theorists over the years. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, so I won't get there today. Okay, so let's turn now to the political economics thing. So as I said before, the economic system makes the social world. So there's a nice quote from Marx here. He says, in the social production of their existence, so when people are producing the world, men inevitably enter relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political and intellectual life. So what he's saying is the mode of production produces our way of thinking. We don't think cleanly or independently of our economic status. Our economic status determines how we think. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. How we think, our identity and personality are determined by the political and economic environment, and particularly our status in that. So our status in the world gives us our values, gives us our belief, it gives us our consciousness and identity. So the media directly assist in the maintenance of the existing political system, and the media directly contribute to how we think. Well, how did they do this? Tell us, Carl. Well, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force in society, the class which has got the power, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. The ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. So here Marx is saying that the media supplies us with only the values of the ruling class. So we get given these values and we inculcate them. Values which are not our own or are particular to our experience of the relations of production. And because of this, we can never become aware of our true class position. We can never really understand where we sit in relationship to the ownership of the means of production. We cannot see the real inequality in the world because we're part of the very systems that legitimate it. Our consciousness is derived from our class position, and all these values come down to us. So our dominant understanding of the world derives from people who benefit from that system. So of course we're not going to have any ideas that allow us to challenge the system, because that would make no sense. We get upset. Instead, we take on board and we learn the values of society, and those values of society come from the interests of the ruling class. Now there's lots of problems with this view, however. So let's go over the key arguments. The culture and media is solely determined by the economic system, and our ways of thinking are determined by our position in relation to production, and the ideas of the ruling elite are imposed upon us. So does that fit with contemporary times? Does it actually fit with our idea? Do our ideas, are they drawn down from the elite prescription, as I said a moment ago? Does Marxist theory work? Or does it fit our reality as we understand it? So is it an accurate description? Are our values alien? Because I certainly don't own the means of production. I'm not a multimillionaire. I don't own any factories. I don't own any digital media production systems or anything like that. So I'm on the wrong side of this. So surely are my values alien somehow? And for this to be true, there need to be only one set of values that we all share. But do we? Is this accurate? And if you look across society, people have different values. We've got a nice picture of the Bullingdon Club. I don't know if you know this picture, but this is a picture of a group of nice people who are part of the Bullingdon Club at Oxford University, and they had a particular culture of going in and to trashing restaurants and so on. So these are very wealthy people, and if you look carefully up here, that's David Cameron there, our former Prime Minister, and down here is Boris Johnson. So our leaders come from this elite group that were doing that. But then the other day the Sun newspaper printed this picture, this group of football thugs shouting, and it's quite a different group of men from there. Do they have different values? Well, of course they do, to a certain degree. Then you've got an opera star. So there's lots of different groups going on in our society. If this crude Marxist version was true, then we'd all have the same culture. We wouldn't have this heterogeneous, fractured idea. There seem to be multiple values in contemporary Britain. That doesn't fit. So this approach has been accused of being economism, this Marxist approach to reduction of complex phenomena and behaviour to simple causes. And it doesn't really fit. The media don't simply put the values of the ruling class across to us. And we're far more sophisticated in our consumption of texts than this. we often do buy into things that challenge the system. So can the theory be revised, or is Marxism wrong? Is this version of Marxism simply wrong? Now Marx himself moved on to later schools. So a lot of sociologists, a lot of media scientists have sought to look at how this works. So historically, political economic Marxists, which is what this kind of Marxist is called, have looked at the ownership of newspapers, of TV companies and of other media outlets, and that this impacts upon democracy, election results and ultimately political power. So the ownership of the media makes a big difference. So for example, 4 main companies own 70% of the UK newspapers, and that the stories that are printed in those newspapers are carried on in television things, and television agenda is often set by what the newspaper editors want to push forwards. They bleed across into other forms of media, and this has a big effect upon politics, upon elections, and upon who maintains power via democratic systems. Now, let's walk forward a few years to more contemporary times and sort of like, well, more digital world. So, as we noted before, Marx's work is the root of 2 key important traditions in media theory: the political economy, which I'm talking about this week, and ideology. We're going to go much more into that next week. Now, Christian Fuchs, gentleman up here, he is a Marxist, political economy Marxist of digital media. He's a professor at Westminster, as I said, and he's written lots of books on this. So he wrote a very good book in 2014 called Digital Labour and Karl Marx, and here he articulates a political or economic perspective on digital media, and he looks at 2 aspects as well as a wealth of other things within this. So he looks at the idea of a value chain in digital media and also the idea of presumption. Okay, value chain. Media and cultural studies has tended to ignore labour in the production process. When we look at television things, we're concerned with what they're about. When we look at mobile phones, well, what do mobile phones do to us? When we look at all forms of digital media, we're concerned with the content. And what Fuchs does, he takes this more political aspect, this economic aspect, and says, well, okay, how did you get that phone in your hand? What systems have been used to produce it? And he talks about a value chain. The production of digital technologies, he argues, involves very exploitative relationships, particularly in the international division of labour. How different stages in this production process are spread across different countries. So for example, if you take out your mobile phone, I've got mine here, and I've got a phone, it's a Huawei, or is it, Huawei. Okay, now all the technology inside it, I buy it from the shop, it's quite straightforward, it's quite nice, but inside there's lots of rare earth metals. Now, these are mined in various countries. A lot of them are mined from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and they're mined by child labour. And so these poor children, from very early age, the same age as my children, if not younger, are used in the production of labour, are used in the production of rare metals. Further up the value chain, there's the production of the components. So they take these rare metals from Africa, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they shift them across to various parts of East Asia, particularly China, Taiwan and Thailand. Companies like Foxconn in Shenzhen in China is the largest information and communications technology assembly factory in the world. So Apple phones and tablets are manufactured there. Now the working conditions for these people in these factories are not very good. Workers have 1 day off a month. They work 12-hour days. So they work compulsory 8-hour days. So they do 8-hour days with compulsory overtime per day of 4 hours. And they get incredibly low wages. There's large numbers of suicides. So for example, some data revealed that in this factory there have been 17 suicides in 1 year. Fortunately, companies brought in a new contract that forbids suicide amongst the workers, so they're not even allowed to kill themselves anymore. I'm not quite sure what the penalty for committing suicide would be in this place. Probably your family wouldn't get the money. But anyway, so the the raw materials are farmed in Africa, taken out of the ground and mined in Africa, shipped across to various parts in Southeast Asia, China in particular, where more exploitation goes on in the production of the actual phones. And then you get to the software world. side. Software is often produced by the Indian software industry. Coders rented to Western companies via body shopping. So companies will hire in coders from India to do these things. Now the problem with that is that those wages are very precarious. They might get 2 days work here, they might get a month's work there, they might get 3 days the following week. There's no way in which they can build their lives very well. So again, it's quite a precarious way of earning a living. And then it ends up in the phone shops in the UK, where you've got phone shops such as EE and Vodafone. And they're staffed by 0 hours contract staff. So people again on precarious things. And then you've got the after-sales tech support system run by people that work in call centres, also again on 0 hours contract. So what Fuchs is doing is looking at the production of a mobile phone such as this one and tracing it back and looking at the forms of exploitation that's used in the production of this. He also then moves on to the idea of prosumption. So that's the other side of the world. So that's just how we make the phones. Now prosumers are people who produce media content as an act of consumption. So whenever you make a little picture and you put it on Facebook, when you comment on Facebook, that's prosumption. When you add a YouTube video, when you add something to Flickr or to Instagram or any of those social media sites, you are engaging in prosumption. You're doing labour, but you're enjoying doing the labour. And Fuchs calls this social labour. So Fuchs, taking the ideas from Marx, says labour may not be waged, but it produces value for capitalism and involves exploitation. So you're not even getting paid to produce all the stuff that you put on social media. That's exploitation, because the company's using that goods to derive money. And it tends to be socially coercive. If you don't take part in social media, you get left out of things. You have to participate or you become isolated. But once you put something on there, you have a lack of control. We sign away control over personal data and rights of ownership to the goods we produce. So our profiles on social media, all the information we're giving Facebook, which we use when we're sharing pictures and things like that, is owned by Facebook. And that's used to sell advertising space to other companies. So we donate labour, but we don't own the means of communication or the product of our social labour. We don't own our own profiles on social media. Now, using Marxist analysis, Fuchs can show how this is part of a capitalist exploitative system. Okay, like with other kinds of work, we may be creative and experience pleasure. But economically, we are alienated from the product of our social labour, just like other kinds of work. So prosumption is social labour, and it's part of the ICT value chain, which connects to Congo, China, India, Silicon Valley and us in this great big long link that goes on. Now, as with wage work, there's also resistance and struggle. We try to find ways of fighting this thing. So then they develop laws and systems like that to prevent us from doing so. So let's go and do a little conclusion. So Marxism is a critical theory for examining social life. It is both a political theory about how you drive change, but it's also an academic theory for understanding social life. And it's what's termed a critical academic theory. It looks at power relationships. And it sees a distinction between the economic system, the base, and the cultural system, the superstructure. If you think back, the base, in this simple interpretation of Marx, the base, the economic system, determines the superstructure. The economic system determines the cultural system. And the superstructure is a consequence of, and it cannot affect the base, but it does legitimate it. And despite our being involved in the production of digital labour, it is just as problematic as other forms of media experience. Well, that's the end of our presentation, so I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you've learned something. Thanks very much.